Hello, and welcome to the Mothers of All Crime. This is a podcast where we deep dive into mothers involved in infamous crimes and scandals. I'm Monica, and this is Crystal.
Our next Mother of the Week.
Yeah, we're talking about Renee Bach this week.
Yes, and I'm so excited to get your opinion on this one specifically because there is a lot of medical personas where
Yeah.
the amount of times going through research that they mentioned her stethoscope and her white coat, it kind of got a little comical.
But you know,
So
that
I
is
can't wait
such
to
a
hear your
thing.
thoughts.
It's
Yeah.
such a thing. Like the white coat signifies something, and a stethoscope signifies something.
Yeah.
And how intentional was that on her part? I don't
Yeah.
know.
So, for those who aren't familiar with Renee, she is a American who was raised in Virginia. She was homeschooled. She was one of five kids, and she was raised Baptist. Her family was very religious. And after high school, she decided she was going to go overseas and become a missionary.
Right. Which is how she ended up going to Jinja when she was 19.
Yes.
Um,
And
it's
she
2007.
joined somebody else's kind of missionary where she went over, she did some feeding programs, helping the needy, and was part of another organization. And then while she was there at 19, she decided she was going to start her own nonprofit called Serving His Children.
Right, right. Well, I guess she did a mission and then she just stayed. So I
Yeah,
think missions are pretty common, right? Is that, always kind of thought that was a Mormon thing, but I guess maybe that's other types of Christians too?
yeah, I when I hear mission, I always think of Mormonism as well, just because I think it's so much part of their beliefs. But I do know that the more committed Christians do mission work, but I don't know if it's like a standardized amount of time. I don't know if it's as organized, if you do it yourself, if the church sends you. I'm not religious enough to know that.
Oh yeah,
But
definitely not, which is going to come up during this quite a bit.
yes. But from what I understand, in Jinja itself, there are hundreds of different like organizations, nonprofits that are related to some sort of church. So there's a lot
Yes.
of different religions that dabble in this area to help, quote unquote, the country and the citizens of Uganda.
There are a lot of Christian run charitable organizations in Uganda, Jinja specifically. I saw something that said that there's about 1,500 white missionaries in Jinja, which is like a town. And I think the town or the city has something like 60,000 people. So 1,500 out of 60,000, still not that much, but I feel like that's a pretty significant presence
Oh,
still.
absolutely. For such a small kind of area in the grand scheme of things. Um,
And
in there's a documentary that came out and they actually showed the map where they kind of put a bunch of dots on it where all these missionaries are. And it's really kind of overwhelming for such a small block radius to have that many so close to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why Jinja specifically. I didn't really get an impression of why that area specific. I know that there's a lot of issues with malnutrition and tuberculosis and malaria and HIV, but I'm assuming that, I don't know, I guess it just happens to be where Baptists go. I don't even know if they're all the same.
I'm
It
not
seems like everyone
sure.
kind of knows each other. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
I'm
the
not
impression I kind of
sure.
got.
Because it's not even one of like the major cities in the country either. It's not super far from the capital in the grand scheme of like the country, but
Hmm.
it surprised me that it wasn't on a more like dense area. Like it wasn't in the capital, it wasn't in like super remote. It was kind of like in between the two.
And it seems like there are several hospitals that are not very far away.
Yes.
Which, when I
And
picture, starving children in Africa, which is what a lot of this is about, I guess I don't picture there being a hospital within 10 minutes. But I guess also that's if you have a car. So maybe it is
right.
more remote if you don't have a car.
Yeah, because you got to think of that from what we learned from a lot of different articles and the documentary that came out and just kind of researching the country. It's not a very wealthy area, it's not a very affluent area. So these people are coming from farms and rural areas that a lot of them can't even read, let alone own properties and own a car and be able to feed themselves multiple times a day, which is kind of sad, but it's the way of life for a lot of people over there.
Yeah, there were several mentions that a lot of the people coming through serving his children, which was Renee's organization, were illiterate or didn't speak English or didn't read English because there's about 50 languages that are spoken in Uganda. So,
Which makes
like,
sense with all of the different missions and stuff coming in. They're going to bring their own language with them. And then if they stay, it makes sense.
oh, that's a good point. Did you watch The Savior Complex, the
I
documentary,
did.
the
Yes. And
docu-series?
I think it was really well done,
Me too.
where it gave a little bit of different perspectives. But I do think that it was interesting on who they left out for the interviews as well.
Hmm.
What did you think about it? First take.
I really enjoyed it, but I felt back and forth about Renee the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Like I
Yeah.
couldn't really gauge how I felt about Renee. I have a lot of gut reactions to, I guess, all the characters and their motives, but I can't, I don't really know, I don't know how I feel about her,
Yeah.
essentially.
She's an interesting one where she kind of there's so many different emotions for it depends on the circumstance on what I feel.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely felt very different. Like, there was a podcast, The Missionary, that came out years before the documentary Savior Complex, and I think that it painted sort of a different picture, but part of it was in the podcast, it's you're just listening to it and you're not watching Renee pose as a doctor, which
Mm-hmm.
in the documentary there are videos of Renee with her stethoscope, with her white coat, seeming to, I don't know, like incriminate herself. And so it was just a
Yeah.
different experience, but I really enjoyed it. I feel like there was, good content produced out of this for sure.
Yeah. And I think it also kind of put some visual stuff in there on, but it also balanced it because there were plenty of images where she's just in normal, like, t shirt, head wrap, and like walking around doing stuff. So it gave a really nice balance of the two where it wasn't only one perspective, which I really appreciate for that specific series.
Yeah. And it was interesting hearing from Renee herself, which
Oh,
I guess we should,
always a good time when they come in.
I mean, it's so much better. But I guess we should get back into serving his children and
Yes.
what happened with that. Because they
Yeah.
started it
So,
in like 2009, I think, is when it
yep.
officially opened.
Yeah. And the original motives and intention with that program was kind of feeding meals to malnourished children and the
Hmm.
needy on a bi weekly basis, doing a feeding program and trying to help the community from that point of view. And from what I kind of gathered, it started off very genuine, where she just wanted to help people. She wanted to feed kids. She did what she could to get resources and funding from people in the United States and her church back home to then be able to bring it over and support feeding these kids.
I really found it interesting how she raised money for this. She was basically an influencer in like
Yeah,
2009.
one of the beginning ones for sure.
She had blogs, which have all been taken down, unfortunately. But she wrote a lot in first person about caring for malnourished and very, very, very sick children. Um, and I mean, provided a lot of names, provided a lot of medical information about kids, which is kind of bad in itself. Um, yeah, and they weren't registered as an NGO and they weren't licensed for years after opening. They were just kind of
Yeah.
casually feeding kids
Well, they were originally registered as a non-government organization,
in
and that's
2011.
how, yeah, that's how they started. So it had, on paper, nothing to do with the medical facility. It had nothing to do with anything like that. However, she started bringing in medical equipment. She started like coupling up with local pediatric hospitals who were contacting her, asking her to help them with kids that they had, which I think is a really interesting kind of start to the shift. Um, at least from my perspective, I think this may have been when her mindset started to shift from
Mm.
helping other people to being the one that people went to, if that
Oh,
makes
that's
sense.
interesting. That's interesting.
Because now she has qualified doctors, she has hospitals reaching out to her saying, we don't have the funds, we're not able to do this. Can you take these children and help us do like a nutrition center with these kids?
She did specifically say that people were reaching out to her and basically begging for help, almost like this happened by accident.
Yeah. So, and then about that time, she started bringing that medical equipment in. She started bringing in qualified nurses from Uganda, but not once did she get changed over to the health license, and not once did she hire on any doctors up to around that point. And I think that's key
Yeah,
here.
they definitely started providing medical services without medical staff. And even when they started hiring nurses, they were not there all the time. And it seemed like Renee was doing a lot of very hands on medical care from her
Mm-hmm.
own accounts on her blogs.
Yeah. And I will say, from the little that I do know about missionaries, prior to them being sent over, they are given like a brief, like they, from what I saw, they range from like a couple weeks to a couple months, like medical training. But most of it is like first aid, minimal kind of things. And Renee started doing some pretty intense stuff, from like IVs on like babies, which for some reason just makes it worse in my brain. Like if you're doing it to an
Oh, yeah.
adult, that's one thing, but there's pictures of like these tiny kids and her just doing things on it and knowing that she has a high school education. That's it.
Well, Crystal, you're forgetting something very, very important. God told her to do it. God was helping her know exactly what to do in every situation. He
True.
was speaking
Yes.
through her and commanding her to do these things, which is like a super convenient way to justify all of your actions.
And
That's
there's no way to
basically what she's.
like tell otherwise. Like how do you go up to someone and be like, no, that never happened? Like you, it's a pretty, I don't want to say scapegoat, but like, because
No,
if
definitely.
you genuinely like believe God is talking to you, that's amazing. But it's very convenient, like you said, that he told her to do these things.
I mean, I just feel like it's a lot of it's God's will, and anytime that someone was saved, they were like, "Oh, praise God for saving them." thank Renee for saving them. And when someone passed away, it's like, well, I guess God just wanted them back. And it's that kind of back and forth, very convenient logic that also was empowering Renee. I mean, she was telling stories over and over, I feel like, of being 19 years old, being homeschooled, not going to college, not going to medical school, but somehow she's in charge of all of these medically fragile kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. To me, that's like kind of a toxic Christian mindset I've seen in other similar, this type of evangelical anyway, which, I mean, if that works for you and you're not hurting anybody, I don't have a problem with it. But I feel like this is where we argue that maybe there is a harm to it and maybe people are being hurt by it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm seeing here. And I thought, um, the first episode for the Savior Complex, I just really loved the title of it, and this is a phrase that was mentioned, which is God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the call.
Oh,
Like
that
you
gave
don't,
me ick. It gave like right away.
well, you don't need training. You have God.
Yeah. Which for anyone who I feel like has gone through medical school or even nursing school, which are hugely qualified, like they're brilliant people. You're going to sit there and look at those people and say that I'm more qualified than you because God spoke to me, but your 6 years of education mean nothing. Like,
I mean, there's so many problems with it. There are so many problems with it, and like I work in healthcare, but I'm not a doctor. So it is important for me to make that clear to people that I am not a physician and that I am not going to be acting as a physician, and to stay within my scope of practice is very important. And I train doctors as part of my job. Like I train resident doctors, I train medical students, like I teach people who have a lot more education than I do how to do a very specific thing, but that doesn't make me a doctor. And I actually do have a white coat. I guess I could wear it, but like I don't because I'll look like a doctor. And I don't want to give that impression because that's not true. And I feel like she took that really the opposite way and just put the stethoscope on at any moment so that she looked like a doctor.
yeah, I really think the coat is what did it for me. Because if you note, like, as you read things and you look at, there's going to be a lawsuit, which we talk about soon, but they always mention the stethoscope and the coat. And to
Hmm.
me, the stethoscope, yes, it means medical, but it doesn't necessarily mean qualified because it's the coat that gives you that mindset change, I feel. But
Mm,
then again, when you're looking at the population she's working with, who they see any kind of medical training as qualified. So just those minimal things, like maybe a stethoscope, could mean doctor to them. So I think that's that interesting kind of shift where, to me, if you have a stethoscope, that just means you're in the medical field to me. Doesn't mean you're a doctor or anything specific, but if that coat really pushes that image. I don't know why.
yeah, I mean, because maybe because the stethoscope is a tool, but the coat is totally optional.
Maybe. I don't
I mean,
know.
the doctors that I work with will sometimes put on their white coats when they want to like seem professional and like
Feel
they know what they're
fancy.
talking about. It is a real thing. It's like, oh, well, I guess
Yeah.
I should put this on because I'm going to really look like a doctor when I do. And it's like a silly thing, but it's also true. And like patients like it. They like when the
Yeah.
doctor comes in a white coat.
It's comforting. It's that comfort that you're like, you know what you're talking about. Like, you're going to help me. But I think one thing that you mentioned that is important that I noticed is you're in the medical field, but you work cohesively with other people. So you have doctors and nurses and support staff, and all those
Hmm.
together make a good environment that's going to actually help people. And in her program, there was Renee, a couple nurses, and then just like general staff. There were no doctors, there were no consultants, there were no other professionals that came in.
And the director was her mother of serving
Right.
his children. So
Who was in the United States.
any complaints raised about Renee by the nurses that are being hired that are working there that are complaining, the complaints are going to her mother and stopping there. I think that
Yeah.
there was a lot of people like raising alarms about what was going on, but it was kind of being ignored. And I think this
Well,
brings up a really interesting, which is I guess what this is all about, is at what point do the ends justify the means? Because I
mhm.
think that if you really believe in Renee's mission, then I mean you don't want to sabotage the mission and you want to do
Yeah.
anything to help her because what a great cause.
Yeah. And it's interesting seeing who was making complaints because most of the complaints going to the board of directors and her mother and all of those people were other staff coming from the United States. The
Mm,
Ugandan staff were not making complaints. And I found two kind of avenues that people kind of talked about. One was, like you said, they genuinely believed that she was helping the community. There were a lot of successful kids that came and left. There were parents that were super grateful. She was taking the heat off of a lot of local hospitals and doctors and stuff. She was bringing money, she was bringing food, she was bringing attention. But then you have the other half of it where the staff, there's not a ton of employment opportunities. And if you raise complaint, you lose your job. And then you don't have income, then you don't eat. And I think it's interesting that after the fact, there were a lot of people saying that there were things going wrong, but most complaints that were made were by Americans working for her because they had that security of being able to say something. A lot of the Ugandans, even if they did feel like something was weird, they didn't have the necessarily ability to risk not having a job the next day.
hmm. Probably. Although I think Constance, who was one of the nurses hired by Renee, wasn't she one of the reasons this all came out? Or was
Constance,
she, or was she
I go
talk?
back and forth.
I think she was talking to Jackie, who was one of the nurses who was from America, and they were the ones that raised up alarms about what was going on. And I don't really know how Constance feels about Renee to this day. I feel like she still is justifying everything Renee was doing. But
Yeah,
I
because
think
I feel like she was supporting that other justification, but also like supported Renee. I think she was playing a little bit of both sides from my
it's all
like what I took from it.
it's also like the absolute horror and devastation of some of the things that they were dealing with in serving his children. Like the a lot of these children were going to die anyway. But
Mm-hmm.
to me, it's like the lack of regulations and the lack of records. And because like I mean I saw some sources that said the death rate for serving his children was lower than most of the hospitals, but also there aren't records of all of these children being there, and all of the deaths are not accounted for, and there are different numbers depending on what you look at. So it kind of makes me not trust any of the percentages. And
Right.
I
But then you
think
got to
that
remember for that exact thing is there's not going to be a lot of records for kids in those villages on the outskirts as well. So, how accurate are those national numbers in addition to that?
you just want to think that hospitals are like regulatory bodies that are keeping track of every little thing. I mean, that's such a, I mean, I guess it's a maybe just an American mindset or a developed world mindset,
Mm-hmm.
but like such a big part of my job is like complying with regulations. I feel like there are so
Yeah.
many standards that are set, and it's annoying to follow those things, but it's also really important. And like hygiene
Agreed.
standards are really important, and practicing within your scope is very important, and documenting every little thing that happens, it's crucial. But if no
Yeah,
one's
and
overseeing it,
I think you're right, but I think you hit the nail when you said like it's kind of a westernized mindset where consistently you see doctors make during interviews and stuff for this case where they're saying they were desperate, they're underfunded, they are overwhelmed with the amount of like need and not having the resources. And the United States is pretty fortunate where they have those resources and have the ability to regulate stuff versus treat as many as you possibly can with the little amount that you have. But looking at
yeah.
some numbers, and I think these are probably the same numbers you found, where the numbers a lot of the time change, but also
Hmm.
are coming from serving his children. So if you're looking at the perspective that like Renee is doing something wrong, there would be question to the numbers that they're going to report. Um, but they came down with 119 deaths out of 3,596 kids that came in, which is 3% lower than the overall average for deaths and malnourishment.
So like by those statistics, it seems like pretty successful. And
Yeah.
I think it would be crazy to say that she didn't help anyone. I think she did help people. But I don't know if the ends justify the means, and I think that there were better ways to go about this, and that's also I don't know. It's hard for me to justify all her actions, I guess, even though I kind of want
Yeah.
to.
And one interesting thing that confused me is so in 2011, the center reported that 20% of the children that came into their facility died. And then 2012, 18% of the kids died. And then in 2013, she hired two doctors for the center. And their death rate went down to 10%. But
Hmm.
I have no idea what happened to these doctors because as you fast forward and the center ended up getting shut down for a period in 2015, they didn't have doctors. So what happened to the doctors?
Well, I think they got shut down though because they didn't have an active license. They like let their license expire.
Yes, yeah. So they got their finally got their health license in 2014, which expired in 2015. But she did have doctors for that short period of time, which can be argued that she recognized that there was a need for them. And then I wondered, did she just not bring them back? Like, where did they go?
I don't know, but I do think that would have been for the best. I mean, you know what I thought was really crazy? One of Renee's sisters is a doctor. Part of part of what I was thinking, part of the empathy I was having for Renee, I feel like is that like she grew up in a repressive, in my mind, repressive environment, homeschooled, extremely Christian, where women don't have a lot of power. And like one of the ways that women can lead is through like volunteerism and activism and charity work. But like her sister's a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Renee, you could have also become a doctor, and that would have actually benefited probably a lot more people. I don't know why that was never like if she thought that medical care was very easy to do, which was my impression, then maybe she should have got a medical degree, and she could have done that in Africa. Like there's no reason that she couldn't have got education to improve things. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I feel like she just didn't think it was important. She didn't think any of these things were important. And so
Yeah,
she just
because
kind
she
of was
also
rogue.
over like ruled doctors. Like doctors would give her direction and advisement and tell her to do stuff, and she would just blatantly disregard it and do what she thought and her gut told her to do. Um, which I think is kind of to that same point. And if she has a sister who is a doctor, why isn't her sister involved in this amazing organization?
I don't know. I
Like
just
again,
think
that to me is a red flag. Like,
there's a lot of red flags.
mm-hmm.
And yeah.
So moving forward, that eventually, obviously, there are going to be mothers and families that are upset. Um, their children are dying, and I think it's important to also note, like you said, that not all these kids were going to survive anyway, which is a really hard thing to swallow. Where here, the idea of a baby dying is kind of unthinkable for like small things, but over there they talk about it like it's just a thing of life. Like your baby might die. And it's heartbreaking to listen to some of them. And eventually, two of these mothers went and had a lawsuit supported by the Women's Pro Bono Initiative of Uganda in 2019. And kind of were fighting for the accountability of the center and recognition for a lot of other children that also had died. And there were two mothers that went in for that court case.
Which I think is noble, to be fighting for answers. And I mean, if your children wrongly died in the care of a non-medical professional, like, you should be entitled to damages. But I mean, it's just hard to say if Renee is personally liable for these things.
Right.
Is
And
that the I'm sorry. What'd you
oh
say?
no, I was gonna say you're totally right, because like these two children found to have died from tuberculosis and malaria were the two like big ones that I read.
Hmm.
And the center repeatedly would say that we aren't equipped to handle those two types of diagnoses. Yet they ended up in the center. And that's where that gray kind of, so what were they doing there then? Like,
Right, right. And they got a little bit less than 10,000 each. They did win. Well, I
mhm.
mean, I guess they settled, actually. They did an out of
Yeah,
court settlement.
out of court settlement, which to us, $9,500, 10K is, it's a lot of money, but it's also not a lot of money when you're looking at a very large organization like that and you're pretty much making a numerical equivalent to what your child's worth is.
Ugh, that's sad.
But then I did some math. Um, the average monthly income for a family in Uganda was about $350 a month.
Oh,
So $9,500 to a family that is surviving off $350 a month, that's a ton of money. And that's assuming that that's a family living in like a city and like near a bunch of stuff. If these families were in a more impoverished area, that's a lot of money to those families.
well, I mean, I hope that it helps them. And I mean, both of them stated that they thought she was a doctor, that she presented herself as a doctor, and their children ended up dying, and maybe they would have died anyway, but I would personally feel better if there was a real doctor there to help. And I think that's
Oh
like
my
the
god,
whole
yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
It's just,
And
this is
they
very
also
different
like,
than, Sorry, I was just
Yeah,
gonna say
they
this is very
signed.
different than other murder cases that we've done, although it depends on who you ask if Renee is a murderer or not.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna get to that too, because like the deception of it too, where those two mothers in specific, they signed paperwork that was written in English, and they don't speak English, they can't read anyway, so
Mm-hmm.
they just signed stuff, had no idea what they were signing, and then handed their babies over to someone who they thought was a doctor and was gonna save them. But as a
Yeah.
result of the lawsuit, she did settle out of court. She had a payment to both of them. She agreed to never practice medicine in Uganda again, which right there. However, the agency, there is a public statement that the agency itself was not found responsible for either of the children's deaths.
Yeah. I mean, there haven't been criminal charges in Uganda or America for Renee or for serving his children. It's all been civil. And I
Right.
think, I mean, there have been multiple medical investigations and they haven't found anything.
Yeah,
But I mean, I also
every
don't know.
investigation afterwards found that she was not at fault, never found any direct evidence of her doing anything wrong. The local community is saying that they appreciate her, they would work with her in the future, they have no issue. Um, they also couldn't find any like hard evidence that supported the allegations that she was just like murdering children. Like it's an interesting kind of, the numbers and the allegations don't match the formal investigations.
It kind of comes down to like, did she even kill anybody? Or did she? It seems like people are very conflicted about whether or not she even did anything wrong. And I feel like there's a lot of speculation about what happened, but again, it's the lack of records and proper documentation. I guess that's the whole thing. But even as I'm listening to this, I'm like talking myself out of blaming her 100%. I don't know. Feels like some of
Yeah.
this was just inevitable. So she was she should have never put herself in this situation. I think that I'm not going to say that being a missionary in Africa is never a good idea, but I do think the saviorism is a problem and that it kind of reeks of a little bit of white supremacy. And I think ultimately Renee just thought she was better than everybody and everything, and she didn't need to obey any laws. And she was just over there literally saving everyone. And to her, all the ends justified all the means.
Yeah. And that's that part of like, I genuinely do think that she started off really genuine and I think she did want to help people. And she just took it too far, where at 19, she was given a lot of power and respect. And I hate to say it, but like, what 20-year-old doesn't have a level of like narcissism and arrogance to them that they just know everything? And if you're then given that like reassurance that like you are amazing and you're doing all these great things, please come help us, it's only going to play on that already. And there's like a type of narcissism called like charitable narcissism, where
Mm,
they like get that drive from like volunteering and people recognizing their amazing help. And like it's interesting where I think she crossed a line and then she didn't know that she crossed it. And she just kind of kept going down that road.
yeah,
But I don't
I
know
feel
if
like
she ever
she.
did it maliciously. That's the thing, is there are some arguments that she was like doing it on purpose and she was murdering these kids intentionally, or she was like related to a Nazi or like all these other things and experimenting. I don't think she ever did anything malicious. I agree where I think she just thought she knew better, and because God told her to do something, that God was gonna drive the right thing, and she just knew better because she had that support.
Yeah, I think that pretty much nails it.
Yeah, it's interesting other people around the facility too, though. So, like, did you read anything about her gardener?
No, what about her gardener?
So, there was a gardener at the facility who came out as a disgruntled employee a handful of times after the lawsuit, um, where he made a lot of accusations about her. So, some stuff we already know, like the stethoscope and the white coat, um, doing IVs, but he also would say things that she like disregarded, like hygiene standards, where she didn't wear gloves during things and would just kind of like do stuff but not wash her hands in between things with different patients. um, but he also said that she would go to hospitals and then try to convince mothers to bring their sick children to her and leave the hospital, which
Yeah,
is
I don't
wild.
know.
And I couldn't find anyone else who gave these accusations except for the gardener, which is a weird dynamic. And a reporter, he had reached out to a reporter doing like an article, and this reporter kind of then was like, he was saying all these things, and she started digging into him, and he's turned out to be like a really weird dude, and was also claiming that there was like in the facility they were poisoning Cadbury products because the kids were eating like candy, like Cadbury candy, and the white man invented HIV to eliminate the African population. He sent
Uh,
videos of child porn to the reporter to support that the white man is a bad person. And like, this is someone who was working in her facility. And like, he was there for like, I think almost 10 years. Like, he was fired in 2017. But it's interesting that, like, of your staff, that is someone that was on your grounds. Like, were there any
yeah,
vetting, or were you just kind of taking people that you know wouldn't say anything in the moment?
I think it comes down to the lack of regulations once again.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need background screenings, we need hygiene standards. These things are literally life or death.
Yeah.
It's so crazy. It's so crazy. The
Yeah.
idea of
I think
her
it's
running
very
around doing
important.
blood transfusions makes me like feel sick.
I also, like, I'm sorry, but like, as an adult, I recognize if you don't know anything and they're coming from these small, uneducated tribes and such. However, if you are a grown adult or sometimes like grandparents will bring them in, and you're looking at a 19-year-old, like there's no secret. She looks super young, and you're just like, yeah, go for it. Like,
It's the white coat.
it is, and it totally is, and it just, I can't even imagine being in any of their shoes. I really can't. Um, but it just baffles me that also at 19 that she was confident enough to be like, yeah, I got this. At 19, I didn't even know, I wasn't even confident with the outfit that I was wearing to like a party on a weekend, let alone like giving a toddler an IV. Like,
But she was getting a lot of praise. And I think
yes.
for someone like her, the praise was fueling her. And then it, it was addictive almost, the attention and the saviorism of it all. Where, I mean, who doesn't want to be a hero? And it's way easier to just decide you're a hero than do the training to become one.
Yeah, that's a great point. is it's that reinforcing. And her mother back stateside, it's so interesting where her mother is very supportive of a lot of it, where any accusation against her, she'd be like, oh, she would never do that. So she never really had that, or at least it's never presented to us that she had a parent looking at her being like, is this a good idea? Should you be doing this? Maybe you should go to school to do this then. Like, she didn't have that other side looking at her being like, let's check this behavior for a second.
I think they were super proud of her. And she wanted the recognition and the praise.
Mm-hmm.
And she got it. But now, I mean, I don't know what she does from here because she has not been criminally charged. She's free and she's back living in Virginia. But
Yes, she's
she's
back.
kind of
She brought back her
recognizable,
2 children. Yep,
right?
she adopted while she was in Uganda,
Selah
and
and Zariah.
who are adorable, by the way.
Sure. And I do feel bad for them in this situation because Renee has been the target of death threats and harassment. And I'm sure that's created some scary situations. They basically had to leave Uganda because it
Mm-hmm.
was getting really bad for them. And I mean, I guess they could go back, but I don't know what they'd be going back to, what her reception would be like there.
Yeah, and one thing that I got to give Renee credit for is when she started getting those death threats and it became unsafe, she took her children and she left, and she went somewhere that her children would be safe. So I got to give her credit where even if she did all of the terrible things that we're talking about, hypothetically proven, because there's a combination, she did do the right thing and remove her children from harm because it's not her kid's fault for her behavior.
Yeah, I know. It is sad though, like that they can't live in Uganda anymore, or they can't right now, I guess. But I guess if when they're adults, they can decide to move there.
Yeah.
I do
Well,
think
yeah.
that if it was becoming a terrible situation for all of them with the lawsuits and the public reaction, then it definitely was the right thing to leave. And it looks like she's pregnant now, based on what I've seen online.
Yeah, she looks very pregnant online. Um,
Hmm.
More recently, I think those pictures that we were finding were like 2023. Um, and
Probably had the baby then.
yeah, she might have. So that might be a third. Um, you mentioned that she might be married. I heard rumors, but I couldn't
Yeah,
find any information about him.
I saw the name Jeremiah Bach in two different places as listed as her husband, but I don't know if that's been confirmed.
His name would be Jeremiah. It's like it just very on trend with our Christian topic. Um, but it's it's a very interesting kind of circumstance because there's no clear kind of conception with it. I don't know.
There's no crime scene, there's
Mm-hmm.
no trial in the sense like it's all kind of open to interpretation. I guess I just want to ask you like what you think would be a fair outcome, consequence, whatever for Renee.
God, I don't know. Um, Also, side note, I totally just Googled it while we're on our chat and I found a picture of her husband. As of July 2021, Matthew Kern.
Oh
He
wow, totally different person.
he looks like a hipster. Like this I'm sorry. Everyone look him up. You'll hopefully find this picture that I'm talking about, but um I don't know if this is accurate or not. So, could be totally wrong. Could be
So
Jeremiah. We don't know.
she might have brother husbands for all we know.
I mean, it is rural Virginia. But to answer your question, I don't know because The problem is this is also an international kind of thing. So you have an American living and operating an organization in another country, which means she has to abide by the local laws and authorities. Where I think it's really easy for us to pick up the story, plop it in the United States, and then have opinions from our mindset. And because something like this, she would never get away with it in the United States.
Mm.
And I wonder if that's why it stayed overseas. Because there are so many organizations and Christian based organizations in the United States that do amazing work. And it's interesting that she chose to found it in another country. Her own parents had a program working, I think it was special needs kids. And she chose to help another country, which is admirable, but the laws are a lot less strict. There's a lot more leeway. The white person gets a lot more credit over there than she would over here. She'd have to go to school over here. And clearly she didn't have to do a lot of things over there. So I wonder if it was a little bit motivated where I want to do this, but I don't want to take the time to do it in the United States, so I'm going to go do it over there.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I do think that her showing up and pretty much immediately feeling like she could fix everything and save everyone, maybe that just kind of fueled this. I think
Mm-hmm.
also though there's like a lot of like romanticized ideas about going to Africa and feeding the starving children, and I think that that was preached in her church. So I
Oh,
think that
yeah.
she just knew she would get a lot of the leads.
So, what are your first thoughts or final thoughts with where it kind of stands now, what she could do? Do you think criminal charges will come around?
So I don't really think criminal charges. I think there might be more civil lawsuits. I would not be
Mm.
surprised about that at all. I think that there may be more. I don't really know what she does from here. Um, I think maybe if she stayed in Uganda, she maybe would have had criminal charges. Like if she kept practicing medicine as she claims. I think eventually she would have gotten criminal charges. And I think if she opened a charitable organization here, that would be well, I don't think she'd be allowed to do that.
Yeah.
I pretty much think she's gonna have to live like in obscurity and just kind of be off the grid for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, the other idea though is I don't know if criminal charges ever would have even come from Uganda. It might have come from like an international standing, but
Ooh,
because if you
maybe.
kind of think about like how much corruption is in government over there and in those countries in general, you can buy your way out of most things. So you got to wonder if they maybe even did know about stuff where there were deals being made, or who knows.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is kind of infuriating, but it's like a non I don't know if I consider her a murderer. I think that she probably helped a lot of people. I think maybe her intentions in the beginning were good, but I think she really lost the plot and she went way too far and she did some things that were not good. And I don't know if anybody can prove that she killed anyone, but I think that she is very dangerous. That's my overall thought.
Yeah, I think she's dangerous without supervision. Like I don't think she would go hurt anyone independently. Um I think she just got to a point where she had all this power and no accountability and it just went off the rail. Cuz I can't see her like volunteering at a hospital and being like, "I got this," like in Virginia. Like but who knows?
No, But I could see her making weird medical decisions for her kids and stuff. Maybe a little bit of
Oh, my brain didn't
Munchausen's.
even go there. Oh, interesting.
It just had Munchausen vibes to me.
Oh, she'll be interesting to like follow up in like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and like what the health of her kids are like. Oh, that's super interesting.
I mean, I hope not. Hopefully she's learned her
I
lesson.
hope not, but that's a very interesting take.
She kind of had similar vibes to me.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is Renee. I think it'll be really interesting as time goes on to like check in on her here and there if she ever resurfaces. But any
Yeah,
final
definitely.
thoughts for her?
I don't think so. Just, you know, she's not my doctor, that's for sure.
All right. Well, that is all we had for this week. And I hope everyone comes in for next week. We have a good list going. I think we already started preparing for next week. And it was so good to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure we'll chit chat soon.
Yes. All right. I'll talk to you soon.
Have a good one.